Hello, everyone. I'm Liam Kennedy, Director of the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin. I'm delighted to act as your MC, or hosting, for today, providing a little bit of continuity. As you may know, we're gathered here in Copley Hall at Georgetown, but we're also streaming live and also recording this event. This is the third Bridging the Atlantic Symposium, now, I'm glad to say, established as an annual event that takes soundings of the Irish-US relationship in the context of broader transatlantic interactions. It's very much a collaborative enterprise. It involves the goodwill and the work of colleagues from Georgetown University, Queen's University Belfast, and University College Dublin, and with the invaluable support of the Embassy of Ireland here in Washington. During last year's symposium, President Clinton provided some resonant remarks about the need for such collaboration to help sustain transatlantic conversations in troubled times. And he urged us, in his words, to keep advancing these conversations, keep building those bridges. Such bridge building is, of course, a work in progress. So, welcome to today's transatlantic conversation, which involves speakers from the US, Ireland, the UK, and Germany. As MC, my job is simple. It's to inform you about the schedule, keep it all ticking along. So let me just tell you briefly about what we're going to do today. Following the opening remarks, we have three panels with an exceptional roster of speakers and moderators, each considering distinctive aspects of the Ireland-US relationship. I'll introduce briefly the speakers and moderators before each panel begins. If you would like further information on the speakers, you will find the details online, the PDF program that accompanies this event. You can see the codes in the QR readers that are posted on the walls here. For those of you who are joining us here in the hall, we encourage questions and comments. We'll do our best to get to those. Time can be a bit tight, but we do have a roving microphone. And during the panels, at the end of those, please raise your hand if you have a question or comment. We'll do our best to incorporate those if we can. I noted that we're recording the proceedings, and that recording will initially be posted on the Global Irish Studies Initiative website. We will also take short breaks between each panel. I think this is a time when we all need a breather at certain points, which is my reminder to you, please mask up when not eating or drinking. And finally, please turn those phones off. That was timely. For opening remarks, I'm passing over now to Dean Joel Hellman, who's Dean of the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kennedy, and a warm welcome to you all. It's wonderful to see you here in person. This is my third Bridging the Atlantic conference. Last year, we kept the spirit going virtually, but I'm so pleased that this year we can bring back those of you live here in the audience and continue to reach out through our Zoom and live transmission. This is a particularly interesting and important conference for me. A bit more about the background of the school and why that's the case. As Professor Kennedy mentioned, I'm Dean of the Walsh School of Foreign Service. It was named after Father Edmund A. Walsh, and it was also our first benefactor was a man named Jim Farrell, who was president of U.S. Steel. Both Father Walsh, Jim Farrell were Irish-American lads, one from South Boston, one from Brooklyn, worked themselves up from extraordinarily modest beginnings. Jim Farrell to become chairman of U.S. Steel, Father Edmund Walsh to become really, I think, one of the most important representatives of the Catholic Church in international affairs of his generation. So our school is deeply rooted, to some extent, in the influence of Irish Americans. And in founding the school, 100 years ago, the oldest school of international affairs in this country, this school was founded very much is a response to, in the aftermath of the destruction of World War I, in which the transatlantic relationship was really the core of rethinking and reestablishing peace, security, and prosperity in the global order. So the subject of this conference The engagement is close to our history. It's close to why we were created in the first place, and I'm so pleased to see over 100 years later that we continue to do this. And I thank so much everyone who's been participating and collaborating in this effort, the BMW Center, of course, the Global Irish Studies Initiative here at Georgetown, Queen's University, Belfast, the Clinton Institute for American Studies at University College Dublin, and of course, the Embassy of Ireland here in the United States. It's wonderful to welcome Professor Kennedy here and Ted Smith from the Clinton Institute. I'm also sorry that Professors Joanne Murphy and Katie Hayward from Queen's University Belfast were unable to be here in person today, but we do really welcome their engagement and their sort of support for this. I wish I could say 100 years after the founding of this school, in the midst of such uncertainty about the future of the global order, I wish I could say that issues of the transatlantic relationship were fully resolved, that this was no longer an issue that would bring a lot of people together for sort of significant engagement and study, because it's so obviously a core of our global sort of security and prosperity going forward. But we do find ourselves in a moment in which the transatlantic relationship has been facing sort of, I think, kind of true challenges that do need constant replenishment, re-engagement, rethinking. And so it's that spirit that I'm so pleased that this conference brings you all together to keep nourishing this central relationship and look for the kind of core areas in trade, the core challenges in diplomacy, the core challenges in security, and the core new challenges that we face, and different global challenges like climate change, like cybersecurity, and so many others. So this is a wonderful opportunity to replenish that relationship. And I'm also so pleased that this is an important forum for us to discuss the ongoing US involvement in ensuring peace and prosperity in Northern Ireland in the aftermath of Brexit and the terms of the North Ireland Protocol. So there's much to discuss. I know you're going to have fascinating engagements. We welcome this here on this campus. We are sort of so pleased as ever that Ireland remains at this sort of central plank now as the only English-speaking nation in Europe, which is extraordinary, and the U.S.'s closest European neighbor, a true bridge between the United States and the European Union, and of course a key player in strengthening the transatlantic alliance. So with that, let me welcome you, and we wish you a fascinating and enriching day of discussion and debate, and we look forward to hearing what you all come up with. Thank you very much.
Welcome from me too, everybody. My name is Katrin Sieg. I'm the director of the BMW Center for German and European Studies. And I'm very pleased to welcome you all in person to this third iteration of Bridging the Atlantic. And even though the poster says Ireland and the US, this third time around, we're actually doing a little bit more of a triangulation than we have in the previous year. So I'm especially pleased to have the BMW Center be a part of these conversations and be a co-sponsor, co-host to this conference. The crisis that we confronted at the last symposium, how to manage the pandemic, the consequences of Brexit, have unfortunately stayed with us. Northern Ireland, as Joel mentioned, continues to be impacted by Brexit, and the situation worries politicians, policymakers, and ordinary people. We will spend some time today discussing the prospects of peace and the dangers of destabilization in a deeply unsettling situation. The pandemic has caused a host of economic troubles, from unemployment to supply chain problems. Panelists will ask whether the recovery programs passed in Ireland, the UK, and the EU and the US are effective in helping to alleviate shortfalls and suffering. How can we link pandemic recovery to building a sustainable green economy and facilitating the digital transition? There's surely much that the transatlantic partners can learn from each other. Two parameters have changed drastically since our last symposium, however, and I very much look forward to today's speakers exploring them. First of all, the elections in the United States a little over a year ago led to a change in government. Although many Americans feel that the severe polarization of our society signals a continuing crisis in democratic governance, the election of President Biden, a seasoned politician, prompted Europeans to breathe a sigh of relief and raised hopes of normalizing transatlantic relations after a period of disruption and estrangement. Secondly, the end of the Merkel era after the election of a new German government recently means that Europe may be striking out in perhaps new directions. With her, the EU is losing an even-keeled, science-minded, moral, and consensus-oriented leader. Is the EU headed for more open confrontation with its increasingly illiberal members and perhaps its neighbors to the east? I look forward to watching our panelists do some stock-taking of the Irish, US, and EU relations after nearly a year of the Biden administration. And I'm curious to hear our experts provide very early assessments of how a post-Merkel EU might change course. Before we turn to our first panel this morning, I would like to personally thank our partners for a stimulating collaboration, and especially my Associate Director, Tina Ruby, for unfailing support in the organization of this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Hellman and Professor Sieg, for providing so many of the important contextualizing remarks I think that we're going to be coming back to. Could we have the first panel, please? If you'd all like to make yourselves comfortable up here. And we're also joined now by our moderator for this panel. Oh, sorry, I'm so sorry. We have one further introductory remarks, but they're virtual. Hence, I threw things off a little bit. Tom, you're very eager. Take a seat for another few seconds. We are going, I think, now to Professor Richard English from Queen's University Belfast. He's unable to join us, but he has a few remarks to add.
Hello, I'm Richard English, Director of the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice here at Queen's University Belfast. And it's a real pleasure to send my very best wishes on behalf of Queen's to the Bridging the Atlantic conference this year. I'm delighted to see that this event has become so established and so ongoing. It's a really important event. It's got great speakers again this year. It's got great speakers addressing important topics again this year. And the ensuing discussions will, I think, be every bit as important, whatever the context within which they're working. Northern Ireland, Ireland, the UK, wider Europe, or the USA. In particular, I think the dialogue, debate, the listening, the argument between people involved in and from those different contexts will be especially significant in these days. So I hope you have a wonderful conference. I hope you have great debate. I hope you have constructive agreement and, where appropriate, constructive disagreement. And on behalf of Queen's, I send my very best wishes from Belfast.
Right, well, thanks to Professor Richard English from Queen's University Belfast. Let me try that again. Would the first panel please take the stage, and please also welcome Dr. Thomas Wright, who's our moderator and director of the Centre of the United States and Europe and senior fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy at Brookings Institution. Welcome, Tom.
You just, you don't need me to speak from the podium, right, great. Terrific. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Liam. Thank you, Dean Hellman, Catherine, Colleen, and everyone who put this together. It's a real privilege to be here on this terrific sort of first panel of this session, particularly since I did my PhD at Georgetown, so it's always fun to come back. And I think this is my first time back on campus since COVID hit 2 years ago. So it's a real treat. But the first panel is on the overall transatlantic relationship, and we are really lucky to have three terrific speakers. So Heather Conley is the incoming president of the German Marshall Fund. Congratulations. And was until very recently a senior vice president right at the CSIS. Edward Luce is the US national editor for the Financial Times. And Peter Wittig was Germany's ambassador to the United States and is now a senior fellow at the School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown and at the BMW Center for Germany and European Studies. So welcome all. We'll try to keep this pretty conversational. There's a lot to discuss. We will be able to take some audience questions, but only from those actually physically in the audience. So I'll come to you maybe in about 20 minutes or so if there are any questions, but we'd love to get your input as well. But Ambassador Wittig, if I could start with you, and really it's been an interesting year so far, I would say. President Biden was inaugurated amid sort of great hopes of a new sort of era in the transatlantic relationship. But in September of this year, there were very significant voices in Europe, including Thierry Breton, one of the European commissioners, who argued that the transatlantic relationship was broken and there needed to be a pause and a reset in the relationship. And that was, of course, coming after AUKUS and the withdrawal from Afghanistan. So have we seen a reset in the transatlantic relationship? Do you think one is required? And how do things look now at the end of 2021 compared to maybe in September of this year?
I think we have seen a partial reset already. If you think back about the Trump administration, we've moved from indifference and sometimes even hostility to the EU, and in the case of my country, to Germany. We've moved to a completely new approach to international relations and to transatlantic relations. This is much more cooperative than it used to be. And in terms of policies, just look at the climate policy. There is a strong commonality now between the Biden administration and the European Union. This administration has become a leader in climate policy. I'm not a great friend to speak in terms of a reset as a kind of a grand design, one great bargain. I think one has to unpack a little bit the segments of the relationship, and I would say we probably 2 or 3 different policy areas where a reset needs to happen. And the first and foremost topic is China, the most strategic relationship that we have in the coming, or will have in the coming decades. Here, this will be a litmus test of the transatlantic relations, the way we deal with China. There are different interests between, partially differences of interests between Europe and the US, but I'm confident that we can set up a common agenda on China, which is needed. A second big issue is Russia. It's probably less strategic than China, but it's urgent because Russia now is once again posing a threat to Ukraine, and we need to confront that. And here again, I think we would agree that this is about deterrence, but also engagement. But the question is, how far will engagement go? Transatlantically is still out there. And the third issue I would name is trade. Here, the Europeans harbored high hopes for this new administration. I think they were disappointed. There's a lot of continuity to the previous administration, a lot of buy American philosophy here. We're not returning to the wonderful imagined world of free trade, rules-based international trade order. But there are also good signs here, establishment of a trade and technology council. So I'm, in a nutshell, pretty optimistic that we can come together on a lot of important issues. I wouldn't call it a reset, but sort of a search which will go on for a couple of years for a common agenda on many international issues.
Thank you. Heather, if I could turn to you next. I mean, President Biden has said throughout the past year that America is back, but there is, of course, concern in Europe, that about how long that will last, about the nature of how the US is back if the focus is on China. Do you see sort of larger sort of structural reasons to be worried? And what do you think the administration and Europe need to do maybe differently in the next 3 years than in the first year?
Well, thank you. And I'm going to cling to Peter's optimism, but I think I may be a little more sober in my analysis. And you're absolutely right. I think what Afghanistan and AUKUS demonstrated to our European colleagues is there's great continuity in U.S. foreign and security policy and trade policy. The Biden administration, different tactics, obviously a softer rhetorical appeal, is following basically the same principles that the Trump administration put forward. And I think that is shocking because the language has suggested a return back to alliance management and maintenance. So I would, just to provoke some thinking this early in the morning before the coffee fully kicks in, I would argue that what's needed transatlantically is a complete in some ways, we have to relearn alliance management and modernize alliance management in the 21st century. I think the problem, in part, two parts of the problem. First, in the United States, and this will provoke, I hope, some conversation, the United States no longer thinks of itself as a European power. If it would have thought of itself as a European power, it would have understood that Afghanistan withdrawal would have created greater instability for our European allies, for migration and heroin flows, that they had a stake in that stability and would have considered engaging Europe more fully. And I think for the Biden administration, and particularly President Biden, who is a transatlanticist, who deeply feels this relationship, in some ways, my argument is his transatlanticism is from the 1990s. It's a dated transatlanticism, and this relationship was profoundly strained, almost broken in the last 4 years. It is a different relationship. It requires different tools. And I think for our European colleagues, their feelings over the last 4 years of the Trump administration. But if we were honest with ourselves, these trend lines have been going on for the last 20 years. Where we feel more brittle and more competitive. The United States continues to tell our European colleagues we are consulting when we're really informing of a decision that the United States has made based on its national interest. So what we see now is Europe responding to that with autonomy, technological sovereignty, trying to create some independent space between the United States and China, or the United States and Russia. And I think this strategically is a great loss for both the United States and for Europe. So this is really, I'm not sure who would reset it, who would reboot it. We have to fundamentally repurpose this relationship, and it's going to be very messy. I think we're going to have what some of my colleagues call a pick-up multilateral game, which means like-minded countries, a few are going to have to start picking up the ball and running a little bit, and hopefully multilateral institutions are going to go forward, whether that's in climate, whether that's on digital issues, questions like that. It's not going to be the same relationship that we've enjoyed. Thank you,
Heather. Ed, I'd love to get your thoughts on this general question, but also, you're one of the most astute and insightful sort of writers and analysts of U.S. domestic politics. And of course, they are very tumultuous and likely to remain tumultuous for some time. Has the United States, when Europeans look at the U.S., are they right to think that it is sort of fundamentally changed and things won't go back to the way they were? Or is there sort of a pathway to having a stable and sort of fruitful transatlantic alliance that will outlast this administration?
It's a very good question. I would agree with Heather and Peter in saying, essentially, to use a slightly controversial phrase, that Biden is, in some respects, Trumpism with a human face. It's a nice guy Trumpism. He's not going to be elbowing Macedonian presidents out of the way for the photo op. He's likable. He, as Heather points out, is instinctively pro-ally, and not just with the Irish, but across the board, across the Atlantic. Therefore, the mood music is extremely different than it was under Trump. But the continuities are actually, I think, more significant. And the one on trade, you asked me about domestic politics. I mean, it is inconceivable, I think, at this point, that the Biden administration would pick up on something like TTIP, would rejoin the TPP or the CPTPP, or would engage in a major new commercial trade investment initiative globally. And that's going to really limit what the Biden administration can do with its partners and allies around the world, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, where the alliances and the partnerships with America tend to be far more commercially focused than they are in Europe, which is more kinetic. It's more, NATO obviously plays a big role in that. And so I think that's a continuity with Trump. The fact that the Indo-Pacific, which was the renaming the Trump administration did, the quite smart renaming the Trump administration did, remains the main theater and focus of action, is another continuity. And I think Europe is adjusting to the fact that it's a secondary theater now, and that's not going to change, and that the US-European relationship is going to be increasingly measured by the degree of commonality they can establish towards China. So, I mean, I would note with the traffic light coalition in Germany, there is some sort of cause for hope there with the Green, with Annalena Baerbock. Is that a mispronunciation, Baerbock? It is, you nodded. It's a mispronunciation.
No, it's
a correct pronunciation. I don't want to mispronounce. Being more hawkish on China, having much more ease of talking about values-based foreign policy, that might be an opening that could help sort of rejuvenate the US-Europe conversation on China. But we should note that Olaf Scholz, of course, was the finance minister in the previous administration and is doing his best to imitate Merkel. So we shouldn't over anticipate a massive shift in German foreign policy. But Peter might disagree with me.
Well, that's
on that
a perfect segue, because that was my next. Was my next question. But Peter, to turn to you on this question, I mean, there is. It appears, significant continuity with the new coalition government in Germany and foreign policy. But of course, there's almost certainly going to be some change as well. As Ed has said, speculation has been focused really on China, and particularly the role of the Greens and the FDP on that issue that may be closer to the US. But what's your assessment of both what we can expect differently in Germany on the transatlantic relationship and also, in Europe and with respect to the future of the EU?
Well, maybe one more sentence, because I come to your question, to the reset issue. I think, too, the Europeans will have to realize that things will not be the same as they used to. They have to get used to accommodate themselves with the strategic shift of the US from Europe and the Middle East to the Indo-Pacific. And I think they have not really realized what that means, and they have to get their act together to sort of factor that in and think about, things like strategic sovereignty, etc., what France has been bringing up. And in a way, the new German government, I think, took this up in a bit because there are three parties. The Greens are a strong factor in this. They have concluded a so-called coalition treaty, which is a German-specific feature, very legalistic approach to forming a government, but this is the way it is. It takes weeks and weeks. They bicker over each sentence, and then there's a contract, and they aspire that this will hold for 4 years, which it usually does. But of course, events come in and shape the foreign policy in particular. But what is notable in this coalition contract, maybe two or three things. First, this will be probably the most pro-European government since Helmut Kohl. There are a lot of confessions in that treaty, that Germany has to serve the European Union, that it has special responsibility for the European Union. So there is really a clear statement that this will be a very pro-EU government with a particular emphasis on that relationship with France. It should be, even more so than in the past, a privileged relationship. The first trip of the new chancellor will go to...
Even with the new finance minister, who's a little
more... The new finance minister, that will be a fault line, when it comes to the nitty-gritty of a new growth and stability pact. He will, I think, be a roadblock in terms of financial and fiscal spending. I think here the Liberal Party has a big foot in the door. But in terms of policy approaches, this document is a nod to Macron. Also because it cites this notion of strategic sovereignty a lot. And the second remarkable thing is really this new government toughens up on China, which will please American decision makers. It really aspires to lure Germany out of this strategic economic dependence on China. It talks a lot about human rights violations in China. It talks about consultations with the US on China, etc. So this is a remarkable shift. On defense, no bad surprises from an American point of view, rather low ambition, but that is sort of also the continuity to the previous government. But at least since this is a center-left government, no bad surprises on nuclear deterrence or other stuff. So I think that should be reassuring. And in a nutshell, really, this is a lot of continuity in German foreign policy. Also, Mrs. Baerbock will be the new Green foreign minister. It's a first. But let's make no mistake. The real crucial decisions will be taken by the chancellor. And we've seen this with Merkel. China, Russia, US, Europe, all the domaine réservé, so to speak, of the chancellor. And this will be the same thing in this government.
Interesting. Thank you. We have a lot to get through, so I'm not going to ask both of you about Germany, but if you have strong views on the new government, please do jump in. But Heather, if we could turn to Russia, yes. Which is very much in the news at the moment. But, President Biden, shortly after he took office, his administration made it pretty clear that they wanted a stable and predictable relationship with Russia. And now we appear to be, on the brink of a possible, Russian invasion of Ukraine. Certainly, U.S. intelligence provided to European allies has suggested that that's a real threat. I guess I have sort of two questions. One, how do we sort of end up in this place, and what does it tell us about how to get to stable and predictable? But also, are Europeans in particular sort of doing enough on the deterrence side? I mean, when you talk to European officials, they say, well, we'd send a very strong message and impose a cost on Russia if they were to conduct an invasion. But that, of course, may not be sufficient to actually deter Putin. So how should we think about this next 6 to 8 weeks in terms of what needs to be done, not just at the NATO level, but also between the US and the EU?
Tom, thank you. I mean, I think this is really important because we do so often focus on the strategic shift to the Indo-Pacific. And when you hear U.S. government officials at senior levels, it is China, China, China. It is just the steady beat. And I think you have to put that into context of what the stable and predictable policy towards Russia is designed to do. And very much, I think, what President Biden, who is a hawk towards Russia, that, again, it's like transatlanticism, that is indisputable. The problem is how his administration is managing that. We want stable and predictable. We want stable, and we wanted to resolve issues. I would argue the Biden administration's resolution of Nord Stream 2 was about restoring allies and resolving issues so that we could all shift towards the Indo-Pacific, so that in part. The problem is the world that we want is not the world that we have. And of course, with Vladimir Putin, and the Russian regime's entire approach as a very cost-efficient power, it's all about instability and unpredictability. That's how they keep us off balance. We are constantly reacting to Russia's actions. They are not reacting to our agenda in any way. So in some ways, I think President Biden in the Geneva summit in June sort of made a bargain, saying, Mr. Putin, I will give you the respect and the, conferring the parity that you so desire, but in return, you're not going to do these unstable acts. And, even President Biden said, we're going to see if this is going to work in 6 months. I think in some ways this buildup right now is the answer to the president's own question. It's been interesting how the administration has handled this. It's unusual diplomacy. I would argue a lot of media, a lot of concern about this military buildup. The Belarus situation adds more pressure to that. It's a testing of the administration. It's a testing of Europe's response. But you feel, and we'll see Secretary Blinken will be meeting with Minister Lavrov after the NATO foreign ministerial meeting. So we'll see what comes out of it. But again, the Russians, we are at their focus. It's now harder to focus on China, Taiwan Straits issues. We are reacting to them, and they hope for a concession. That is what this is all about. What will you give me for this buildup? So I think we're at a very unstable moment. My reading of the situation is the buildup both in April and May of this year, and now what we're seeing, it will be a time of the Kremlin's choosing, of what they decide to do, when they decide to do it. But I think this extensive of a buildup and the mobilization that they are practicing speaks to me that they believe that time is not on their side with Ukraine. They had thought by taking bites out of Georgia and Ukraine, Kyiv could not get close to the EU and NATO. What they're seeing is, regardless of membership, a very close relationship. Once Ukraine does have defensive weapons, let me be clear, these are defensive weapons, they will be more resistant to Russian influence, and over the long term, that doesn't benefit the Kremlin. So time is not on their side. So I see this as there will be greater instability in this part of the world, and what I fear is the rhetoric is there. If Russia takes steps, well, the political will be there for action. This will be the first test of Chancellor Scholz's regime, and it will divide the coalition, I think, quite clearly. It will be a profound test for the Biden administration. And I think we also have to be very cognizant of the increased dynamic between Beijing and Moscow, where they are supporting each other in being disruptive to the West. So this is a very, very concerning dynamic. There are no good answers other than managing it, but Mr. Putin's going to keep pushing it until, either he's trying to provoke the Ukrainians to do something so he can justify invasion, or the West, or over time, I think he's going to have to do something to slow down Ukraine's now increasing defensive posture.
Thank you. Ed, just picking up on Heather's remarks and maybe expanding it out the lens a little bit. President Biden's spoken about this struggle between autocracies, and democracies. With what looks like, a possibility in Europe, a Russian invasion of Ukraine, what are we on the brink of? I mean, what does it tell you about not just US foreign policy, but sort of the state of world politics? I mean, is it more brittle than we assumed? I don't think anyone sort of anticipated, a year ago that this might be the situation we will be confronted with today. So are we looking, assuming we do sort of come out of the pandemic at some point, at a conflictual sort of great power rivalry that is akin to a multifaceted, Cold War, or are we, will Europe sort of revert back to the status quo ante, and it will be more sort of about US-China relations?
I pick up, I agree with everything Heather's just said. I pick up, particularly on the time factor, that in Putin's head, the clock is ticking. Now, Ukraine might not be a member of NATO, but its military is becoming increasingly interoperable with NATO, with its NATO partners. The United States, Victoria Nuland recently, Jake Sullivan, talk about their unwavering commitment, ironclad commitment to Ukraine. That's how you talk about an ally. It's also, incidentally, how the Bush administration talked about Georgia in the build-up to the 2008 crisis. So we should be wary, I think, of giving Ukraine the impression that it actually is an ally. But in Putin's mind, the more time goes on, the more de facto Ukraine becomes part of the West. And of course, it's got the EU deal, so it's now under the EU regulatory system. And it's getting an increasing amount of lethal weaponry from the United States and others. So that's what's in his head. The Democracy Summit next week, Ukraine is invited. Taiwan is invited. And I think most people in this room would have seen the joint letter that the Russian and Chinese, or joint article that the Russian and Chinese ambassadors wrote in the National Interest last week. A very bombastic article claiming that this was an offensive move by the Biden administration to divide the world into autocracies and democracies, and a provocative move. And we are the true democratic, if you define it by their definition of democracy. So this summit, I think, is taking quite a big risk. I think it's a bold and necessary move by the Biden administration to say, after Trump, we value democracy, we value human rights, we value alliances. But if it produces very little in terms of deliverables, and if it is seen as a talking shop rather than as something that can be really integrated with the hardcore interests of American foreign policy, then I think it risks deepening cynicism about America's leadership role on democracy and opening up more opportunities for Russia, China to exploit that cynicism. I'll just say one final thing about this sort of terrible specter of possible Russian, or maybe probable Russian, military action in the Donbass region, or thereabouts this winter. It's unclear what the obvious unified American European response to this would be, other than more of the same, unless we are prepared to treat Ukraine de facto as an ally, which I think would be a dramatic calculation to make. And therefore, I suspect in some way Putin is going to want to test Biden. I think Biden is seen as a paper tiger, potentially, by Putin and by Xi Jinping. And that I would not be surprised to see coordinated tests of this administration in the South China Sea and in Central Europe and Eastern Europe in the coming months. It's a pretty ominous few months we're in for.
But if you're Putin, you also have to worry about the next sort of the first couple of weeks. You might have the test, right? But 2, 3, 4, 5 months in, if you're involved in a pretty significant conflict with Ukraine, backed up by Western weaponry, that's a difficult scenario for him too. So there are dilemmas all around. Peter, if we could maybe just get your thoughts on this as well, but also just to the point Ed was making on democracy versus autocracies. In Europe, people often complain about the US making world politics more ideological by injecting this element into it. But when you probe more deeply, they don't actually disagree that there are real differences between democracies and autocracies on technology and on human rights norms and international rules. So it seems there's broad agreement, on the prescription of what to do, but maybe some difference on the diagnosis about how to label it. What's your sort of general sort of take on the Democracy Summit, and to what extent are relations with countries like China and Russia, to be viewed through the prism of autocracy versus democracy?
I think to hold such a summit was logical, given the commitments that Biden had made in the beginning. I don't know what the deliverables are. I think the West, if there is still such a thing, has reason to be humble. The US have reason to be humble, considering that American democracy seemed to be in danger. So I think Biden himself was very humble about it. And he said, we have to regain, after the 6th of January, regain the trust of our allies. So the triage, the selection, was also, I think, a very difficult task. Who's in, who's out, who's considered to be a democracy, who not. I mean, Hungarians are furious that they were not invited as the only EU country.
They should strengthen their democracy then. It's pretty easy for them to be invited.
It is a double-edged sword whether this can really make a difference. It's probably a strong symbol, but will there be a follow-up? We've seen a couple of those initiatives before. Madeleine Albright initiated a process, and it seems to me it's really symbolism much more than really policy.
So, Heather, we're going to come to you next, but I think we have about 12 minutes. So I want to, if there's anyone who has a question, we can integrate it in, but just sort of wave and catch my eye. And I see one lady here, so let's take a question, and I also have a question.
Not yet.
I don't think it's on.
No.
There, that's better, yes. So you've been talking about Europe largely as a single bloc. Macron and France have been discussed separately from the Germans. But what about the challenges of democracy within Europe as well? How, especially, do the situations in Poland, which we've seen recently with Belarus, of course, and also with Hungary, fit into both your analysis of Europe as a whole and very much your analysis of the situation regarding the Ukraine?
Great, thank you. Terrific question. Any other questions? Again, okay. Yes, Jeff. Yeah.
Hey, Jeff.
Jeff Anderson. Yeah.
Yeah, Jeff Anderson, BMW Center. I just want a little more perspective on this idea of continuity that you talked about in the first round, that the Biden administration is showing continuity with the Trump administration. I mean, wouldn't it just be as accurate to say that the Trump administration, in some regards, was showing continuity with previous administrations? I mean, I think about the arguments in Europe today, they're reminiscent of 2009, where Europeans suddenly realized that Barack Obama was not going to shut down Guantanamo, was not going to withdraw from Afghanistan, was not going to revive TTIP, which incidentally, sorry, that was later. Clinton was the one who, in the run-up to the election, abandoned TTIP. So there's a long arc of continuity here. But in important regards, Trump abandoned the continuity by calling into question NATO, by actively seeking to undermine the EU. And that's certainly not something that the Biden administration is doing. So how accurate is it to talk about the point of reference for continuity being the Trump administration and not the longer arc of US foreign policy?
If I could just add I think it's a very important question by Jeff, but if I could also just add a slight angle to it, because Ed, you talked about the trade side and the protectionism, but of course the message in successive elections now has been national popular concern about globalization and the impact of an open global economy to some extent. And so I guess part of the question is what's a reasonable sense of continuity with some protectionist sentiment? Like how how can the US government and governments in Europe control globalization or manage it more so it's affects the middle class and others in a more positive way without sort of going too far on the protectionist road. So we'll come to you in a second on that, though. But Heather, I mean, I guess if you could address maybe the Hungary-Poland question, which is quite important. And since we only have 10 minutes left, I wanted to throw another thing in the mix too, since we are at a Global Irish sort of conference. We've had this big event, Brexit, that I think is maybe underappreciated as a reordering event in Europe. You know, it's often treated as a domestic politics issue in the UK, which of course it is, but I think it is more significant than that too. And I'm guessing this is a question for the whole panel, as you also answer these other questions. But how does Brexit change the role of both Ireland and the UK in the broader transatlantic relationship? So Heather, let's start with you. I know there's a lot on the table there.
That's okay, I'm going to go really fast. Well, in some ways, I'll link sort of the Brexit question with the Poland-Hungary. I could even add Turkey to that. I think if you believe sort of the center of European power, Berlin and Brussels, I would consider the corridor together, and Paris, Europe's having a hard time holding its periphery. And that's, I think, how you have to put that in context. So for Poland and Hungary, and there, in fact, several weeks ago, I participated in a hearing, the Helsinki Commission on democratic backsliding in Poland and Hungary. Hungary has been much discussed, but I believe I was told this was the first time that Poland in a congressional hearing was focused. And I think I can only gauge my own personal reaction to the feedback I got from my testimony. Nothing from the Hungarians. They don't care. They don't care anymore. They are in a different place. Poland, they cared deeply. They cared because I very provocatively said this should be part of a factoring of our own assessment of U.S. force posture in Poland, because what are we defending if we don't have democracy at the heart and the community of values, which is, the essence of NATO. And that set off a whole bunch of fireworks. But what I got, though, emails from Polish civil society and former diplomats begging the U.S. to engage, begging there to be a much more concerted effort. And I would say, sort of to Jeff's question on continuity, and you're right, we need to define continuity in very specific ways and not be so broad generally. I would say the problem is now the partisanship here in Washington has crept in to this space. So Republicans love Poland and Hungary too much. I think Democrats underinvest in it. We need bipartisanship so we have that continuity of policy. And it doesn't radically swing every 4 or 8 years when the next person comes in to unravel what the last person did rather than proceed forward. But I think this also speaks, to be honest with you, all the assumptions I believe of U.S. policy towards Central Europe have now been, proven incorrect. That the straitjackets of NATO and EU would manage these problems. Well, what we found is once they are in the club, we don't have tools to do anything about it, and they understand that. And so, in some ways, they dare the organization to challenge them. And so we are now in a place where it's going to take a decade, even if Mr. Orban does not win the election next spring, it will take a decade to unravel the patronage networks and the corruption and the total changing of major institutions. So this is not going to flip a switch with an election. Poland will have the same challenge. Just finally on sort of Brexit, Ireland, what I am struck and watching the last 5 years is extraordinary Irish diplomacy within Europe, managing this in the run-up, the activism, the focus. I think now, though, diplomacy is a different place for Dublin, because on the one hand, it needs to make sure this is a seamless process on the border, and it's now having a difficult time managing the punishment messages coming from Paris because of London's intransigence on the Northern Ireland Protocol. So I think this is going to be a very difficult waters to navigate. I think there's been so much turmoil in the UK that Boris Johnson's backing off right now. He can't manage this kerfluffle in addition to everything else. But it speaks to me of this is a long-term process. This is a decade, 2-decade process. And then finally, I would argue, I think there's so much more we need to do bilaterally with Ireland on the Digital 9, technology, the fact that so many US companies are now headquartered in Dublin because of Brexit. There is just great opportunity. So I think we just need to seize that and grow it, particularly in the transatlantic technology and digital competitiveness space, because if we get that wrong, we get the transatlantic economic relationship wrong for the future. So I think they play a core role. Sorry, I went on too long.
It's a great point. And you know, just with the technology piece, I think that is likely to become more front and center, but it hasn't been maybe so much in the past. But obviously, given the role of technology and all the issues we talked about earlier, and the fact that so many of the companies are headquartered in Ireland, it would seem like a natural area for cooperation. Ed, if we could come to you next. I mean, there's a lot on the table there, so feel free to address, you know, any and all of it, but particularly on this sort of point about post-Brexit and, you know, as the US sort of looks at Europe and the UK in particular, and the friction with France and, you know, the possibility of contagion to the rest of the alliance. Like, what do you think the long-term sort of impact will be?
I mean, we didn't mention AUKUS and the French fallout with the Biden, with the English-speaking powers there. You know, I think it was a reminder that the Five Eyes is at the core of American alliances, and that Brexit is, you know, it's not helpful to the Americans. It's definitely not helpful, I say in a very biased manner, to the British, but that's another debate. But that it was a very clear reminder that the degree of trust and cooperation between these 5 countries is something that, you know, doesn't exist with any other. I mean, Germany, I know some powers would like to be part of the Five Eyes, or have expressed a desire in the past, but it would take a massive cultural shift for that to happen. So I don't see any dramatic security implications arising in the short term from Brexit. I think the longer term answer to that question depends on the degree to which European strategic autonomy happens. And, you know, Macron, if he's re-elected next spring, which I expect he will be, is going to feel a renewed mandate to push for that. AUKUS obviously was, you know, a big wake-up call for the French. I think they were fairly performative in their response to it, but
just a teeny bit.
All credit to them.
But successfully got a lot of things.
But successfully,
it worked.
It worked. I mean, let me just underline one thing, because I know time is short. I'm picking up what Heather just mentioned. You know, Ireland is the final remaining English-speaking country inside the European Union. You know, before Britain left the EU, sort of an open secret that actually Ireland and Britain had a lot of overlap in how they viewed trade and commerce and outward-lookingness of the EU. And so, you know, this is another loss to Ireland, because it's lost a big partner that was pushing that agenda. I think that the Irish are an ideal bridge in terms of a digital conversation with the United States and helping to forge common digital standards on competition, but also, you know, also in terms of the Democracy Summit on values and on protecting an open access internet. And that if we want to see something that would be significant globally, including vis-a-vis China, this is the trade and technology piece is a very, very fertile area to explore. And is much less fissile in domestic US politics than having conventional trade talks. So I'd hope to see Ireland playing that role, and I think it's ideally positioned to do so.
Great point. Thank you, Ed. And Peter, we give you the last word, but you know, love your thoughts on this question, but particularly, I mean, as Berlin and Germany looks at this, what do you think sort of the sense is there on the long-term geopolitical impact of Brexit on the transatlantic relationship? And can Ireland, as Heather and Ed were sort of suggesting, be that more bridging voice to the United States? And what of relations with the UK? I mean, Germany's always been sort of assumed to be less, how to put this right, I mean, less sort of naturally suspicious of Britain's intentions maybe than France can be. But we've seen a real deterioration in the French-UK relationship. So how much does Germany sort of worry about that? And is there a role for the United States in trying to repair that relationship?
I think the Germans worry a lot about this, and I'm personally shocked about the state of relations between the UK and the European Union. I served there as an ambassador until recently. This relationship, UK-EU, is at a very low point. And the trust level, and I'll be frank here, in this current British government and the current British Prime Minister is at, minus degrees centigrade at this point in time. And, it goes without saying that not only my country, but the EU as a whole is standing firmly with Ireland on this intent of the UK government to revise a set of agreements that were just concluded at the beginning of this year. And so I see this as a major challenge for that relationship, the UK-EU relationship. And you've mentioned the dramatic deterioration of the French-British relationship. Who could have thought that they engage in, luckily, in a war of words so far, and there is such a big agenda of bilateral issues, and it almost seems to be like an adversarial relationship of two very important allies. And mentioning Ireland and the Northern Irish issue, the new government in Germany has included in this treaty explicitly a phrase saying we demand the UK to stand by the agreements, and in case it violates those or revokes unilaterally those agreements, the EU should use the full arsenal of measures, of countervailing measures. And that's pretty unusual as a statement. So I take this seriously. It has weakened Europe. The way this Brexit happened has weakened Europe. And I see a job for the Biden administration here to use its influence on the UK and be a sort of mediating factor here, because it will weaken the alliance if that continues.
Thank you. And I know we have a panel later, I think, specifically on sort of the US role and the Good Friday Agreement. And so we won't get into the protocol issues per se, but it is a very important issue. Obviously, it will be discussed later. I think we are out of time, but this is a really rich conversation. We covered a lot of ground. There's still a list of questions here I didn't get to ask on COVID, on climate, but hopefully we'll have the opportunity to talk about those again. But I'd like to thank our three panelists, our audience as well, our audience questions, and our virtual audience. And with that, this panel is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you. Everyone recongregating here, and hello again to those of you who are watching or listening from elsewhere. On to our second panel on the US-Ireland trade and investment. Great to see that this has already been teed up in so many ways from our first panel. Early last month, Ireland's Minister for Finance, Paschal Donohoe, welcomed US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen to Dublin. And in his remarks, he noted that she was, and I quote, leading a much-needed revival of principles-based international economic diplomacy. The transatlantic relationship is very much the crucible of such diplomacy and its multilateral possibilities. Over the last year, the US and the EU have made commitments to work together on economic recovery through sustainable and digital transitions and tackling global trade challenges. A significant initiative has been the establishment of the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, mentioned in our first panel. It met in Pittsburgh in September, and it's working to deepen transatlantic ties in technology and trade, helping to develop a more integrated transatlantic economy. Ireland is very much committed to that integration, and our panel will consider the mutually beneficial impact of US-Ireland trade and investment, and how Ireland can help strengthen the post-Brexit EU-US economic relationship. The panel is moderated by Niamh King, who is Deputy Director of the Aspen Strategy Group and the Aspen Security Forum at the Institute. Thank you, Niamh.
Thanks, Liam. And good morning, everybody here and also across the Atlantic. Good afternoon. Delighted and honoured to be here. Thanks to Georgetown and Colleen and all of the partners for this third bridging the what is it?
Atlantic.
Bridging the Atlantic. Thank you, Dan.
Not the Pacific, the Atlantic.
Delighted to be here for this illustrious panel. Here we have Ambassador Dan Mulhall, who, as you all know, is the Ambassador of Ireland to the United States and poet extraordinaire in his part-time. And then we have a wonderful panel coming to us from Ireland. We have Dr. Siobhan Roach, who's the Director of Science for the Science for the Economy for Science Foundation Ireland. We have Dr. Jane Brady, who's the head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service, and Marjorie Chorlins, who's the Senior Vice President for European Affairs at the US Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to you all, and sorry to not be seeing you in person. Dan, as you're here in person with me, why don't you, we had a very good introduction by Liam, why don't you kick us off and tell us of the general state of affairs of US-Ireland and the trade relationship?
Well, I always like to talk up things that are less well known, and the well-known bit of the Irish-US economic relationship is the presence of 800 or so US companies in Ireland, which are one of the mainstays of our economy, which generate 2/3 of our exports and which employ 170,000 people. And the pipeline is very strong. We still have a good flow of companies coming into Ireland. Even last year, despite the ravages of the pandemic and the disruptions to international travel, we still had a good number of US companies either expanding in Ireland or establishing there for the first time, using Ireland as a base from which to explore the opportunities of the European single market. That's the well-known part of the story. The less well-known part, which I want to focus on today, is the flow of investment from Ireland to the United States, which is something that 20 years ago we probably wouldn't have been encouraging. Now we do, because we understand that if Irish companies are to become internationally viable, they need to have a base not just in Ireland, but perhaps in the European Union and in the United States. And many Irish companies choose the United States as their foreign investment destination of choice for reasons to do with, I suppose, shared business culture, linguistic, and the fact that Irish people feel very comfortable operating in the United States. So about 75 companies from Ireland come into the US market every year with investments. And Irish headquartered companies now, there are 900 in all, are employing about 300,000 people across the United States. And that number is increasing all the time. That would have been unthinkable 10, 20, 30 years ago. No one would have imagined that Irish companies, Irish headquartered companies, could be so much a part of the American business environment. And that's a very important part of the story, and it's this part of the story that I like to emphasize all the time, because I want to make the point, fundamentally, that this relationship economically is a two-way street, okay? 19th century Irish people came across the Atlantic in their millions to help make America what it is today. 20th century, we saw a flow of tourists and investment and know-how from the United States to Ireland. And now we're getting a two-way flow, not just of trade and investment. By the way, the trade relationship now is about $150 billion a year when it comes to investment or trade in goods and services. Two-way trade in goods and services amounts to about $150 billion, which is an extraordinary figure for a country like ours with a population in our state of just 5 million. And then the final 2 points I want to make is that it's not just investment and trade, it's also educational links. Ireland per capita is the biggest recipient of US study abroad students. We have 11,000 in normal years. There are literally hundreds of liaisons, relationships between Irish universities and US counterparts involving students from the US spending a semester or maybe a year studying in Ireland, which is a very strong basis for the future evolution of our relationship. And then finally, we estimate about 1,300 research partnerships now between Irish universities and institutions of research and their US counterparts. So all of that amounts to a really important relationship, not just for Ireland. Of course, it's supremely important for us because the US is now by far our biggest, our most important external economic partner. But I think it's a big enough relationship to be important to the US also, because we're now in the top 10 of foreign investors in the US, and our trade is a significant volume of trade, even for a country like the United States.
Indeed. And Marjorie, if I can turn to you, the US perspective on this two-way street, please.
Sure. Thanks for the question. And first off, thank you so much to Georgetown and its partners for inviting me to join the conversation today. I have to tell you, anytime I have the opportunity to join a conversation about Ireland, I generally jump at it because it is such a good news story. So thank you for including me. I will say it's very hard also to follow Dan Mulhall because he is so good at telling that good news story that I'm not sure there is a lot that I can add. But let me just focus on, he's giving you the statistics. Let me just focus. Excuse me, let me just focus on why it is American companies are so interested in the Irish market. First off, obviously, Ireland is a rules-based democracy with strong pro-trade and pro-investment policies. Much has been said, but I think not enough, actually, about the young, educated workforce. Dan just talked about the university exchanges and things like that. I think that actually just feeds into the creation of an ever greater and stronger workforce, both in Ireland and frankly here in the US as well. Ireland is a global leader in research. Dan talked about the number of research partnerships among universities, but clearly a number of American companies that have invested in Ireland have done so for investment in R&D, so strong IP protections. And yes, of course, obviously, in addition to the pro-trade and investment policies, Ireland does have tax policies that are very favorable. But that is not really the principal reason why American companies invest in Ireland. The other thing, obviously, here again, Dan, I think noted this, Ireland as a platform for American companies to operate in Europe is extraordinarily important. The fact that you have as many American companies as you do, having invested as much as they have in Ireland, is a reflection of how important this market is, how important Ireland is as a market unto itself, but also as a platform, as a bridge into the EU.
Great, thanks, Marjorie. Now I'll turn to Dr. Brady and ask her about, from the Northern Ireland perspective, could you add that colour to this picture, please?
Yeah, thank you so much. Delighted to be here. To tell the Northern Ireland story, which is, again, very positive. I am head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service, recently taken up post, but prior to that, my background is in innovation and technology, and I worked in the private sector and spent many years in international, including North America. So I know really how critically important our relationship with the US has been, both in bringing us peace, but more latterly bringing us prosperity and being a broker and supporter of that. And you look to the figures, we have about just under 200 companies here based in Northern Ireland, and they're employing 20,000 people. And those are high value propositions. We are the #1 centre for US investment in cybersecurity. And I'm also a proud graduate from that university, Queen's, so delighted to be representing them also today. But building on those areas where Northern Ireland has those specific expertise and actually can provide us from a platform to grow and expand globally and address higher productivity regions. We've also had significant investment in terms of our city deal investment across the island of Ireland, about 1.2 billion. And those are the areas where Northern Ireland is really strong, but some of those have been underpinned by actually our US relations, most substantially by our very significant fintech presence here in Northern Ireland. Allstate came to invest in Northern Ireland around 25 years ago, underpinning very significant investment and supporting research in our universities. And through that, we have a very sustained and growing sector and leadership within fintech, within Northern Ireland as well, which is actually creating our own cluster of companies. We've been highlighted as one of the key growth areas and clusters in this sector internationally, one of the top 8. Talked also about kind of creating that ecosystem and that cluster and that relationship and how important our relationship with the US has been in underpinning that and that long-term piece. But also just want to reflect on Ambassador's comments as well. That is a two-way proposition. And also Northern Ireland has a great position to play into international relationships in terms of our exports. The US is our second largest export market, and we exported about 1.4 billion in the last year. And again, those are areas where Northern Ireland are really strong. So, you know, our legacy of aircraft and shipbuilding are built now into very substantive manufacturing sector. Our screening and crushing material from the middle of Northern Ireland, we represent 40% of those exports, and those are very significant exports to the US. Again, also in our life and health sciences, where we have growing clusters, but very significant expertise. I also was a partner in a venture capital fund and was recipient of funding from our pension funds in the US again. So underpinning those other aspects of investment, and I guess delivering from a Northern Ireland perspective, the double bottom line return, so the economic return, but also the support and the rebalancing of our economy. And I guess in a venture capital perspective, our companies always look towards their first landing point internationally, and that is without doubt most usually within the US component. So as I see the platform where we have now in Northern Ireland, we've got to a very promising and a very ambitious perspective. And actually with the investments we're making in our city deals, we are at the cusp of providing some very significant step changes in our economy. So the importance of actually renewing and building on that relationship is ever more critical to us as we deliver the next decade of opportunity for linkages and for our economy here in the North.
Thanks very much, Dr. Brady. Now I'm going to turn to Dr. Roach. Vaughan, we've heard about the relationship on research between America and Ireland being lauded. How does Science Foundation Ireland fit into that? And how do you develop these partnerships and international partnerships across the Atlantic, please?
Thanks, Niamh, and thanks for the invitation to speak today and talk about the work that SFI does that's of relevance to the discussion today. So for those of you that don't know us, we're the national funder for STEM in Ireland. We're actually modelled on the National Science Foundation in the US. One of our first Director Generals came from the NSF. Very strong links with the NSF. And I suppose within SFI, we have a vision to establish Ireland as a global innovation leader in STEM. And that is through funding really cutting edge research that makes a very strong impact on the society and economy of Ireland. And that then is through a focus on partly supporting enterprise competitiveness and development with the focus on both Indigenous companies, but also on attracting and retaining FDI. And as part of that latter piece, we do have a very strong focus on profiling Irish science globally. We actually had a presence in the US up till the start of COVID. The individual came back, but the role of that was to market kind of the great science that's happening in Ireland. As we've heard from some of the other speakers, we are leading internationally. We're 12th in the world in terms of the quality of our overall science, number 2 in immunology, 3 in agricultural science. So we've really come up the rankings over the last number of years. So we have a very strong relationship, as we've heard, with the US, particularly from an R&D perspective. So of those 1,300 collaborations that were talked about, a lot of those have been supported through 2 main vehicles. So there's our US-Ireland program. It was a program that was developed. It arose out of the peace process and is a partnership with funders in Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and also with the NSF and the NIH. And it's all about developing tripartite partnerships between researchers across the 3 jurisdictions. There's been over 100 million has been invested into that to date, and we're still funding more partnerships. Even we're discussing them this morning in work. The other main vehicle, I suppose, that we use for building these international partnerships is the state has made a massive investment in what we call large-scale research centres. So over 800 million has been invested to date. And these are large-scale public-private partnerships where they're focused on areas that Ireland has identified as economic importance. They can be areas such as manufacturing, agriculture, pharmaceutical, science, I'm forgetting ICT. These are main areas. And what we do with these is we bring together the critical mass of science expertise in Ireland across the country into these virtual centres. They're required to work in partnership with companies. And of the 1,200 different enterprise collaborations that these centres have, a third of them actually involve US companies. So the US is the main partner for these collaborations, and companies from the US have invested over 100 million into these research. So these are cutting edge R&D collaborations that are not about kind of the near term impact on a company, but it's taking that longer term perspective to ensure future competitiveness. The other kind of point to note is in the context of the SFI centres is they're a wider network of industry and academic institutes, not just based within Ireland, not just involving US companies, but also have a lot of partnerships with the UK, with Germany, with France, with Switzerland. And it's actually when companies engage with these networks of centres, it's actually the wider network that proves to be really beneficial from that. So to just give you, I have two examples of how this kind of partnership approach can really have an economic and a societal impact. So there's one large-scale partnership that we announced earlier this year, and it's in the area of climate research. So it's our Terrain AI partnership. It's €5 million co-investment between SFI, Microsoft, involving Microsoft's headquarters in Ireland, but also the operations in Redmond in California, and Maynooth University. And basically what the partnership is about is developing a digital data platform that's capable of kind of integrating a variety of data sets, Earth observation data sets, so satellite data, drone data, and then on the ground sensor data. And it's all about using this data to understand how land management practices can actually influence carbon emissions in farms, in the landscape, and then promoting more sustainable land use practices. This is something that's starting kind of almost as a pilot within Ireland and the US, but the bigger ambition is to scale this on a European perspective and beyond. So it's a really great example of how these partnerships can grow. It's not only just kind of one multinational that's involved, we actually have a number then of Indigenous SMEs that are involved in this partnership. So it's a great approach for kind of addressing societal challenges, but also then ultimately supporting economic competitiveness of the companies involved.
That's great. Thanks very much, Siobhan. And we'll turn back to climate later. But now I'll go back to Ambassador Dan. There was some excitement in the OECD, said people not very often, in the last 6 months, about the global corporate minimum tax of 15%.
Yeah.
They announced in October. Now, Marjorie mentioned earlier that it wasn't the only reason maybe why Ireland's attractive to investors, plenty of other reasons, but maybe this was one of them, but that's changed. We're now at 15%, or will be in 2023, I believe it is, right? Can you talk us through that kind of decision,
Sure.
what this means globally for Ireland?
Yeah, well, look, our tax regime is one of maybe 4 or 5 factors that has driven the transformation of the Irish economy, which I witnessed in my lifetime. After all, when I first joined the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs back in the late 70s, Ireland was an outlier in European terms. We were perhaps 2/3 of the wealth level, the average European Union wealth level at that time. And we've caught up over the last 50 years comprehensively, and we're now in the very much in the advanced group of European Union countries in terms of our economic development and our wealth levels per capita. And that has been driven by a model that consists of heavy investment in education, which I benefited from. I'm sure you also were able to benefit from that growing up in Ireland. Also, membership of the European Union, which was a completely transformative event in Irish history, in my view, and the facts are just so stark that they're incontrovertible, which is why we have 85% support for EU membership in Ireland. Thirdly, I think a government that over the last 50 years has been consistently pro-business, has consistently aimed to provide a platform in Ireland which is conducive to companies operating successfully in our country. I think the quality of our workforce and their flexibility has been important, and frankly, the tax offering that we made. The key thing about that tax offering was that it was a consistent offer, that it lasted for a generation or more at 12.5%. And that's why we were initially loath to make any change to that. But we recognized that there was an international groundswell in favor of a global minimum tax. And eventually, our government agreed to join the global consensus with a global minimum tax rate of 15%. We argued strongly against the idea that that would be a sort of a kind of a minimum that would also be pushed up. So in other words, what we didn't want to see was inflation in tax rates. We didn't want to see this 15% being the beginnings of a process. So we see this as a once-in-a-generation decision that will provide vital stability for companies that are looking to their investment options for the future. And if this is applied on a global basis, this will not disadvantage Ireland in any significant way, in my view, because we will still be able to offer a 12.5% rate for companies with an annual turnover of less than $1 billion. So the 15% rate will apply to companies, the really large companies with turnovers of over $1 billion. So we believe that we will still be an extremely attractive location. We believe we will be the premier location of choice for US companies in Europe. And by the way, I would include Northern Ireland in that, because under the European Union, UK-EU protocol on Northern Ireland, Northern Ireland will also have the advantage of full access to the European single market, which ought to make Northern Ireland attractive for foreign investment. And I always take the view, by the way, that if an investment project goes to Northern Ireland, that's good for us too, because it increases the wealth levels of people on the island of Ireland, and Northern Ireland people who are employed in these areas will come south, for holidays, and will buy Irish goods and services. So I think that investment across the island of Ireland is a very good thing for all of us, and I think that's why I'm fairly bullish about the future when it comes to investment, because I think companies now will be able to see that there's a minimum global corporation tax rate of 15%, but that Ireland will still be offering a very competitive tax rate. Plus, we will have all those other advantages that accrue to us from being a member of the European Union, access to the European single market, and also from having a highly educated, flexible workforce, and finally, from having a track record of having over the last 50 years shown through the success of US companies that Ireland is a place where they can thrive and prosper, drawing on the advantages of being located in our country.
Great. And Siobhan, if I could turn to you, do you share this view? Is that what your partners are saying from you being on the ground in Ireland?
Yeah, so we view that, I suppose, the tax rate was only one aspect of an overall value proposition for Ireland, and it really is about, I suppose, the as we've heard about, that highly educated workforce, the investment that has gone into that, when we engage with companies, it's all about who are the leaders in this area of research. That's who I want to work with. So that very much influences investment decisions into Ireland. I think the other unique advantage we have is, as a small country, we're highly interconnected, and that, when a company comes in and is making a decision to invest, it actually gets access to a wide system of supports in Ireland. We work very closely with the IDA, Ireland, the Inward Investment Agency, in profiling the opportunities in Ireland. The other key strand that has come up is, I've talked about the research centres and how the state has consolidated the research areas of economic importance for Ireland into these large-scale centres. So they're almost a one-point stop for companies that want to come in. So it's the wider, I suppose, portfolio of supports that's really important here. So I suppose so far the signs are that the investment, the foreign direct investment, is still staying strong.
Thanks. Now let's turn to Brexit, as we talked about in the first panel. Brexit leaves Ireland as the only English-speaking country in the EU and the remaining 27 member states, but also it probably changes the relationship between the US and Europe a little bit. We mentioned it possibly being a bridge, to use that metaphor again. Marjorie, do you want to talk about how the Chamber may be leaning on Ireland now that the trade relationship with the UK is different since Brexit?
Yeah, I think how the US is leaning on Ireland is not altogether different than how we have traditionally relied on them as a voice of reason at the European decision-making table. They have consistently brought a voice that is strongly supportive of business and innovation to the table, and that's something we obviously will continue to rely on. The circumstances are different, with that comparable voice from the UK not at the table any longer. But if anything, what we look at is the opportunity, frankly, for Ireland to step up and join with some other key member states across the EU to make sure that where Europe is focusing its attention, for example, on digital policies, indeed, those policies end up being pro-competitive, pro-innovation, and don't reflect an unduly heavy hand when it comes to new regulation. I think all of those themes are very consistent in the messaging and the positioning that Ireland has taken traditionally, and it just becomes that much more important for it to continue to demonstrate leadership and bring along other member states as well.
Dan, do you have anything brief on that?
Well, I take the view that first of all, Brexit is a very complicated business. It's a project driven by political factors rather than economic ones. I don't think anyone credibly would argue that Brexit is a kind of an economic bonanza for anyone. It causes difficulties for Ireland, difficulties for the UK, obviously, difficulties for the European Union. And of course, one of the big difficulties for Ireland is that it's true, we do lose a partner around the table in Brussels that on most issues on the European agenda was kind of on the same page as us, and therefore we lose that partner in the UK that was pro-free trade, in favour of lighter touch regulation, all of that. So in a way, the negotiating environment in Brussels is more complicated now for Ireland than it was before. But nonetheless, we believe that we belong in the European Union. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind or in the mind of the vast majority of Irish people that our future is within the European Union. And when you think about the level of solidarity that we enjoyed over the last number of years from our European Union partners in the negotiations between the UK and the EU on the future relationship and on Northern Ireland, that was an extraordinary expression of solidarity, which I think has only underlined for Irish people the value of EU membership. But in terms of the transatlantic relationship, we want to step up more. I think we have the capacity to do that. And by the way, I'm not as pessimistic as the last panel were about the transatlantic relationship. If you look at what's happened over the last year, you've seen the Airbus-Boeing dispute essentially resolved. You've seen progress on the steel and aluminum tariff issue. You've seen the establishment of the Trade and Technology Council. You've seen a better atmosphere between the two sides. So I'm not saying it's a slam dunk. I'm not saying we're there, but I think we're in a better position than we were before. And I think we're always inclined to exaggerate things when they're good and exaggerate them when they're bad. I think at the moment they're in the middle somewhere, but I think there's good potential for us to move forward, especially now as we're addressing, in the working groups that have been established at the TTC, we're addressing issues for the future. And we're not looking at necessarily a major free trade agreement between the EU and the US, but looking at how we can work together on issues that are relevant both for the United States and the European Union in the global context for the future.
Great, thanks, Dan. I'm going to turn now to Dr. Brady in Northern Ireland. Certainly uncertainty is a word that is bandied about a lot with regard to Northern Ireland. Can you talk us through how you're managing? And there's still no certainty regarding what the outcome may be, Article 16, what will happen. Can you tell us how you're managing through these challenging times?
Thank you. And I know that Katie Howard is in the next panel, so she can comment more fully in terms of the nuances. And you're right, what businesses are looking for is stability and certainty. But actually what Northern Ireland has always been very good in, our businesses in particular, is being entrepreneurial and dealing with levels of uncertainty and ambiguity. So largely our businesses are going and progressing, and we've seen the Northern Ireland economy actually over the pandemic restoring to pre-pandemic levels. And in fact, many of our US-based companies here have grown during that period. And that's, I guess, testament to the innovation and research that we have, in addition to the skilled workforce. So during that period, we've also closed investments into major centres of excellence in our research areas, in both at universities. And those are focusing on the areas where Northern Ireland has a competitive advantage. Those are in life and health sciences, in our advanced manufacturing sectors, which we talked about previously, and also a really emergent sector, which has come over the last 10 years in the area of screen and digital. Very strong US linkages. Obviously, the Game of Thrones was filmed first in Northern Ireland, has created a legacy, and we're investing in high-end definition on screen and media technologies with our universities in terms of supporting that economy. So whilst there are, of course, areas and certainty that will be dealt with in the coming months, business has been getting on, universities have been getting on, research has been getting on. We have delivered during that period a new economic strategy, which is called 10X, a decade of innovation, really doubling down and focusing in the areas, recognising Northern Ireland's a small economy, but the areas where we actually have differentiated value, and we have large pockets of low productivity. I guess a recognition of what we need to do to bridge ourselves beyond in those areas to high productivity sectors, and life science, of course, and advanced manufacturing are key proponents of that. I think looking towards where our proposition has been broadly as an FDI element, a lot of that has been around our skills base, and we have some excellent skills base and a very highly qualified and also dedicated workforce. And over 70% of the companies who invest in Northern Ireland reinvest and all stay. But actually where we're looking towards with that 10X decade of innovation is actually how we create the clusters that grow that level of scale that encourages our Indigenous companies, and those export links to the US will be key parts of that. So we have been busy. We have gone back in many of our areas to pre-pandemic levels. We have been very committed from an innovation and research perspective, our city deals and growth deals, which are progressing very well in that regard. And I guess we're looking at this from our perspective as this is a moment of discontinuity, and this is a moment in those areas of discontinuity where we can step and make a difference. And we're very much marshalling in behind that to identify what those areas of opportunity, particularly in the areas of innovation and where we have differentiating values, and how we can actually step up and deliver the transformation in the next decade coming.
Great. I'm glad you got to give Game of Thrones a shout out too for our panel today. If I can move back to Marjorie, please. Marjorie, there was fierce excitement in the lead up to the Pittsburgh meeting for the Trade and Technology Council, but it happened, and that's great news. I think it's a sign of positive developments between the EU-US relationship. Can you tell us what you're the most hopeful for that came out of that meeting, and just any reflections you may have?
Sure. Thanks, Niamh. I think Dan put his finger on a really important point, and that is that despite the deterioration in the relationship between the US and Europe over, frankly, the last decade or so, the creation of the Trade and Technology Council, as well as the resolution of some of those outstanding disputes, really represents an opportunity to truly reframe the relationship, which is something that both President Biden said he was interested in doing. Even as a candidate, he talked about that, but also European leaders. So the creation and the launch of the TTC, which is something the Chamber was advocating for, even in its when it was just an idea, a spark in somebody's eye, was very much something we were glad to see. From our perspective, for this effort to be effective, there are a couple of key elements, right? You need a realistic agenda that's underpinned by some basic principles and that has significant political support at the highest levels. I think you have the potential for all of those three things to be in play with the TTC. I think as far as the principles go, there are some really essential principles like the importance of not discriminating against one another, whether implicitly or explicitly, with overly burdensome regulations, the importance of trying to identify areas where we can really lead the way on behalf of the global economy, and also use it as a platform where we can talk about the issues where we have significant differences. So those are sort of our expectations going in to the TTC. The other key component I should emphasize, obviously, but sort of take it as a given, is the importance of stakeholder input into the process. There have been dialogues and platforms in the past where conversations have happened between policymakers, but without sufficient input from stakeholders from all sides of the table, frankly, to make sure that the policies that they're considering are indeed realistic and will achieve the objectives that they're striving for. So, starting point, excellent. The creation of 10 working groups, a little bit cumbersome in terms of how they're planning to sort all of this out. I mean, I think there are some really important opportunities to cooperate on technology standards for emerging technologies like 6G and quantum. There's an opportunity to partner together on cybersecurity and supply chain vulnerabilities. There's been a discussion about climate and green tech, extraordinarily important opportunities where both the US and Europe have significant strengths when it comes to green technology. So another very important point. Promoting SMEs access to digital technology, I think, is another obvious thing that we both should be doing. And to the extent we're able to do that together is extraordinarily helpful. When you think about the work that the TTC wants to do on issues like investment screening and export controls, where can we work together, either to align our policies or to press in multilateral fora, for example, on export controls, to ensure that we have the right balance of controls that allows us to trade in advanced technologies, but also ensures that those technologies are kept out of the hands of people who don't share the same values that we do and who do engage in unfair practices on a host of levels. I think the real question is, when you get to the issue of tech policy or digital policy, to what extent will this be a good platform to work on those issues? So, for example, data underpins everything that the TTC is about. Right now, we don't have a strong regimen in place that allows for legal certainty around data flows between the US and Europe. If we don't have that, it's really hard to see how we make progress on a number of these other issues. In addition, there are steps that Europe is taking on the regulatory front in particular as it drives for greater technological sovereignty. that do call into question whether there is that fundamental commitment to things like non-discrimination. So for us, using the TTC as a platform, not just to talk about the sort of looking forward issues when it comes to technology, or dealing with the immediate issues like green tech, like cybersecurity, or the challenges that we're facing from non-market economies, it also needs to be a platform where we can ensure that as the two sides are developing new regulations, there is an opportunity to discuss them, to exchange best practices, and to make sure that some basic principles are reflected in new policies. I talked about non-discrimination, but due process is another really important one, and rule of law standards and things like that. So we're optimistic about what the TTC can do. We're also realistic about it. I think it's very important for people to understand that this is not a resurrection of the transatlantic trade and investment partnership negotiations. It's a nice effort, but this is something very different, more focused, very important opportunities here, as long as the US and Europe can have hard conversations about some of these issues where we risk going in divergent directions.
Okay, very interesting. We have any audience questions, please? If we do, you can raise your arm and there's a mic. Yeah, great. In the second row back there, please.
Hi, my name is Joe. I'm a freshman in the SFS here. And my question is regarding TTIP. Is there any commitment from Ireland and the EU and the United States regarding this economic initiative? Do we expect to see any change on TTIP moving forward? Or are you looking to build a new solution?
Dan, will I turn that over to you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we have to be realistic that TTIP didn't quite work out the way it was intended. By the way, it was during Ireland's presidency that we managed to get agreement within the EU on the mandate for the TTIP negotiations, and we started the negotiations under our presidency. But unfortunately, they didn't prosper in the way that we had hoped they would. So I think we're now looking at talking together about ways of avoiding unnecessary trade barriers, supply chain resilience, technology standards, particularly standards for emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, investment screening, and global trade challenges. So I think the agenda has switched from a kind of a big negotiation on a big trade agreement to a series of negotiations that are connected but are focused on particular issues that maybe we can find a way forward on that will have the desired effect, because the desired effect has to be, first of all, avoiding trade turbulence on the transatlantic trading front, and secondly, increasing the trade and investment partnership between the EU and the US, and then also, of course, contributing to a global trading and investment environment that is rules-based and that is conducive to the future interests of the United States and the European Union, which, by the way, are more or less are certainly on the same page and are very, very similar. And we have, I think, a vested interest, EU and US, in ensuring that the future trading and investment environment is one that is influenced and suits our particular interests and needs. And that is not a given in today's environment. So I think working together will be important in helping to forge a global trading environment that is conducive to the kind of economic model that we have both in Europe and the United States. That, I think, is one of the big sort of challenges for the future, as opposed to a big trade agreement. That may come in time, but I think we're addressing these issues now in a kind of a step-by-step way. We're breaking down the topics into categories and trying to deal with them individually, and then link the various issues together, and that would be then conducive to the further deepening of the already extraordinarily important economic relationship between the United States and the European Union.
Terrific. Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. But so let me say thank you to all of our panelists that are coming in virtually. Many thanks to Siobhan and Dr. Brady and Marjorie. And of course, a big thanks to Ambassador Mulhall for his insights as ever. And I think we're adjourned for now. Is there a coffee break, Liam? 10-minute coffee break, and then the last panel led by Ted Smith. Thank you very much.
As we know all too well in Ireland, North and South, peace is a precarious thing. Brexit has been and continues to be radically disruptive of the order of things and has injected considerable uncertainty into economic and diplomatic relations. A particularly daunting challenge raised by Brexit is the question of how it will impact the peace process and comity on the island of Ireland, a concern that has its own dramaturgy of events and actors. Currently, we are fixated on challenges to the Northern Ireland Protocol. More on this, I'm sure, in the panel discussion. Our panelists from Northern Ireland and the US will discuss the current state of the Northern Ireland peace process with a particular focus on the border, the future of power sharing and the role of the United States. Discussions in Northern Ireland sometimes generate more noise than insight, but that will not be the case today, as we have a highly informed panel and a moderator of exceptional diplomatic talents. I refer to Mr. Ted Smith, a distinguished leader in government and public affairs. He's been a senior executive at 2 Fortune 200 companies and an Irish diplomat. Last and not least, he is chair of the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin. Thank you, Ted.
Oh, thank you, Liam, for that exaggerated flattery, but it's always welcome. We do have an excellent panel to discuss this vital subject of keeping the peace in Northern Ireland and the role of the United States potentially appointing a special envoy to Northern Ireland. Who'd have thought that peace was at risk again in Northern Ireland? But it is. So to discuss this today, we have here online Congressman Brendan Boyle, Democrat of Pennsylvania. You're very welcome, Congressman Boyle. He's a member of the bipartisan Friends of Ireland caucus, co-chair of the European Union caucus, proud son of Irish immigrants, and played a key role in President Biden's victory in Pennsylvania last year. Professor Katie Hayward, Professor of Political Sociology in Queen's University, Belfast. You're very welcome. In addition to your academic writing, Katie writes regularly for The Guardian, Belfast Telegraph, and the Irish Times. She is an Eisenhower Fellow and a Fellow of the George Mitchell Institute for Global Peace and Security at Queen's University, Belfast. Brian Rowan, journalist and author, a former BBC security correspondent in Belfast, won many awards. His acclaimed book, Political Purgatory, The Battle to Save Stormont and the Play for a New Ireland, was published earlier this year, and I highly recommend it. Bruce Morrison is a former congressman and co-chair of the ad hoc committee to protect the Good Friday Agreement. Renowned for his work on the Irish peace process since the 1980s, he introduced the Morrison visa program, which allocated thousands of visas each year for 3 countries, including Ireland, North and South, that have been disadvantaged by the 1965 immigration legislation. So, folks, here we are, year 2 of the endless pandemic and COVID, and also year 5 of the endless and contentious post-Brexit EU-UK negotiations. For those of you not fully conversant with the situation, when Britain decided in 2015 to leave the EU, the new land border between the EU and the UK became the 300-mile border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. In 2019, the British and EU governments agreed that keeping that land border open without police checks was a key part of the 1998 Good Friday Agreement and essential to maintaining the peace. And so they signed the Northern Ireland Protocol, designed to prevent such a hard border. However, since then, the British government and unionists have threatened to walk away from that protocol, saying that it creates a new sea border between Northern Ireland and Britain. With that, let me turn to Professor Hayward, speaking from the ground there in Belfast, so to speak. How bad is the situation? How contentious is it? And could it really threaten the peace?
Thank you very much, Ted. And it's a great honour to be on this panel. And I only wish I wasn't on the ground in Belfast and was rather with you in Washington. The protocol is contentious for several reasons. And let's bear in mind, of course, that actually the protocol has very much changed Northern Ireland's relationship with the rest of Ireland and changed Northern Ireland's relationship with Britain, both in symbolic and in very pragmatic, practical ways as well. And it lacks legitimacy, even though it is part of an international UK-EU agreement. And that legitimacy is lacking because, in part, Northern Ireland really had very little say or input in the negotiation of the details of the protocol. That was, of course, worked out between the UK and the EU, and we didn't have Stormont sitting at the time, which also made a difference. And also the impact that the Northern Ireland Protocol is having in terms of its effect is obviously, at the moment, it's largely negative, put in the context of Brexit, which is having obviously negative effects on the relationship between the UK and the EU more broadly. So in effect, the protocol was trying to manage the disruption caused by Brexit. And it is not surprising that there's been a lot of focus on the negative impacts that it's been having, notwithstanding some of the positives that I'm sure we're going to discuss as well. Most particularly, it's contentious for unionists, and the survey work that we've been doing in Queen's has been showing very much that for the majority of unionists, particularly those who would consider themselves hardline unionists, they very much oppose the protocol because of its symbolic and practical consequences on Northern Ireland's relationship with Britain. Most particularly, it's worth bearing in mind too that unionists consider it to represent a betrayal by the British government, bearing in mind that Boris Johnson, having promised at the DUP conference to not do anything that could potentially divide or separate Northern Ireland from Britain in any way, negotiated this protocol, which very much puts Northern Ireland in a specific and distinct situation. And it's also seen as contentious by the UK government, which, as I say, negotiated it. And that's just what I just want to focus on most particularly now, in that what the British government doesn't like around the protocol is not so much, I think, the details in terms of customs and checks in relation to agri-food, etc., but it's also about what the protocol means. So essentially, the protocol means that the UK remains tied to the EU in very significant ways through Northern Ireland. Most particularly, that includes the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. And it also affects certain rules around state aid, etc. Bearing in mind that Lord Frost, who is the, in effect, the Brexit minister for the UK, co-chairs the joint committee that oversees the withdrawal agreement and the partnership council that sees the trade and cooperation agreement. Lord Frost himself says the whole purpose of Brexit is to allow the UK to do things differently from the EU. That's made very constrained by the protocol, and therefore, given that the EU has opened a door to discussing adjustments to it, they see their chance in this now. I wouldn't say that there is a direct threat to peace. Loyalist protests around the protocol have been small so far, notwithstanding the very significant sense of aggrievement through the protocol that's widely felt by unionists. But I do think there is a risk to, obviously, the context of the peace process itself, which is always centered on that British-Irish relationship. And now that British-Irish relationship is subject to changes in that UK-EU relationship, which is very much under pressure at the moment, including quite significant tensions. So in that way, everybody feels insecure and slightly apprehensive about what might come next.
Thank you for that somewhat pessimistic analysis, I guess. Somewhat a contrast with the Christmas lights in your background. By the way, congratulations, you look wonderful. Brian Rowan, turning to you, the Vice President of the European Commission has hoped for a deal with Britain before the end of the year on the protocol, and he would argue that they've shown flexibility, reduced 80% of the checks and so forth that were being introduced under the previous protocol. But that he says the British government doesn't appear to be wanting to move that fast and have the political will to do so. What's your reaction to that, Brian?
I was just chatting to Katie about this before we came on air, and I think it depends what this negotiation is about. Is it really about this deep concern for Northern Ireland, or is there some other game on the board? And what I mean by some other game on the board is this suggestion that what it's really about is that a row between the UK, the British government, and the EU would play well with Tory voters, to Brexit supporters, and that all of this may be a negotiation with the next UK general election in mind. When I listen to Lord Frost and when I listen to Boris Johnson, it's as if they weren't part of the original negotiation that put the protocol in place. It's always somebody else's fault. And I agree with a lot of what Kitty said just before me. I don't see a threat to the peace at the moment. The violence that we've seen from loyalists has been sporadic, it's been localized, it's not widespread. I have no doubt that there are those in the loyalist paramilitary leadership who have a foot on the brake. If they wanted this violence to be widespread, it would simply mean a flick of the switch. And I think they understand that that widespread violence is, what it results in is self-harm, destroying their own communities. It gets them nowhere. But they also understand, even though they may not say it out loudly, that it was a UK Prime Minister who left Northern Ireland behind in this fallout, play out from the Brexit decision. I think Brexit was unthinking. I think, when people talk about the protocol here, those who oppose it, they talk about it almost separately from the Brexit project. But Brexit, I think, was a blind alley. They ran down it. They followed Boris Johnson. They followed the UK government. And there's this sense now of part of the unionist loyalist community being constitutionally unnerved, that the protocol has created further difference and distance between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom. So if this negotiation was just about trying to iron out the paperwork, the new rules of trade, then I think you could, and we've already seen the EU move some distance and quite a far distance in trying to resolve those issues. But if it's about major surgery and an absolute renegotiation of the protocol in the bin and starting all over again, then I think we're in a very difficult place. But when you raise the constitutional question here in Northern Ireland, what we have in 2021, in this centenary year, is not any sense of celebration in the unionist loyalist community, but more a sense of crisis and crossroads and sellout and betrayal and all of those things. Make negotiations difficult in terms of, can the UK government deliver enough for the unionist leadership here when there is that mood that the union is under threat, and at a time when not only do they see the union being under threat, but that the New Ireland conversation is becoming louder here, and some would say more creditable.
Good. Well, thanks for that very comprehensive response, Brian, and we'll get into some of that. I'd like to turn to Congressman Boyle and former Congressman Morrison now. What do you think the US Congress and the Biden administration would do if the British government walks away from the protocol? Congressman Boyle?
Well, first, it's just great to be with you. Thanks, Ted, and to my fellow panelists. Much of the focus of those of us who care about this issue here on Capitol Hill, as well as in the administration, has been on preventing that from happening. I still am skeptical that in the end this British government will actually walk away from the protocol, despite all of the the rhetoric they present to it. I think Brian hit the nail on the head when he talked about actually this British government politically, domestically benefiting from just having the fight or having the row. I tend to think that is what it is about. Once they were to actually cross the Rubicon and tear up the protocol, then they would have to live with the consequences of that. And I think that it would be quite severe here in Washington, as well as, of course, in Europe. Right now, actually, if you think about it from a purely political standpoint, not a matter of morality or right and wrong, but pure politics, right now, Boris Johnson is politically able to have his cake and eat it too. He's able to have a fight with Brussels. He's able to rhetorically wave the Union Jack, and he and David Frost are standing up for British sovereignty, standing up to the oppressive Brussels regime from their perspective, of course, yet at the same time not have to live with the consequences of actually following through on their rhetoric. So perhaps this is, in a strange way, a more optimistic slant that ultimately there will be a resolution to this matter and that cooler heads will prevail in Westminster.
Thanks for that. And Bruce Morrison, what's your take on it?
Well, I think that Congressman Boyle has put it very well. There won't be any happiness whatsoever in Washington if the protocol is undermined. And there's been a lot of talk about Article 16 and the technicalities thereof. It's really not within the power of the British government to just walk away, unless they're going to walk away from the entire withdrawal agreement and many other things. The Article 16 is not a blank check. It's a process, more negotiations and more arbitration and the like. So it's easy to talk about these things as if there weren't consequences, as Congressman Boyle has said, but then if you actually do them, there are consequences, legal consequences, trade consequences, consequences with your partners in other agreements, such as the United States. I think there will be a very negative reaction, and it will cost the Johnson government a lot in their relationships with the Biden administration and with the US political leadership if they don't work this out. But I don't think anyone should think that this is what it purports to be, which is a negotiation about the details of Brexit or its implementation or the effect on Northern Ireland. I think this is, perhaps as Brian Rowan has said, largely a domestic political performance by the Johnson government. But it's also in Northern Ireland, the realization, I think, in the Unionist and Loyalist communities about the extent of change in the circumstances, not just demographic change, but political change. It's no longer 1921 or 1922. It's not even 1998. The forces of looking outward from Northern Ireland in other communities, and perhaps even in parts of the Unionist community, suggest things are not going to be the same a decade from now as they are now. And I think people have lived on the myth that this changes, sometime in another century. And I think that's not the case, whether this is unification in the purest form or this is some other kind of arrangement, a halfway house. There's no question these things are coming. And if we're concerned about the peace, we have to be concerned about that process, what's going on there, what's really behind the fact that a Billy Hutchinson, who sat at the table and signed up to the Good Friday Agreement as a loyalist and entered the political process, has turned his back on the Good Friday Agreement. This is serious business, and I think we need to look at it in that context, not just as a trade dispute.
Good. Well, thanks for that, Bruce. And the winds of change blowing in Ireland and Northern Ireland. And I guess I have to ask the question, and I know people from the floor here are interested in it too. Would the appointment of a US Special Envoy help at this difficult time in Northern Ireland, the way it did in the past with Senator George Mitchell and Richard Haas, Gary Hart, Mitchell Rees? I think I'd like to get the view on this from both Washington and from Belfast. First of all, Congressman Boyle, you've been you're very close to President Biden, and there's a lot of talk in the campaign about appointing a special envoy. Do you favor that, and do you think it's likely to happen?
I do favor it. I mean, I favored it in previous administrations. I advocated for it at the tail end of the Obama administration when I first got to Congress. I advocated for it during the Trump administration and still do. You know, ultimately, the tough decisions have to be made by the leaders of the political parties themselves. However, we have seen time and time again, and not just George Mitchell, a number of special envoys since then who have played a positive and constructive role. You know, whenever someone is the U.S. special envoy and they have that U.S. attached to their name, it carries a certain weight. We've also seen the way special envoys have been able to play the role of a mediator, or at least a go-between, at very fraught times over the last almost quarter century. Now, in terms of whether or not it will happen, I do believe it will ultimately happen. As we're here in, what is it now, December 1st, geez. So we're almost at the end of the first year of the Biden administration. And frankly, the pace of, appointments has been slow. We see a holdup in the Senate, unfortunately, on a number of key diplomatic posts. So I do think that it will still take some time just because of what is ahead of that appointment in terms of in the queue.
But do you think it might happen?
So that's, excuse me, I thought I said earlier, yes, I do believe it will ultimately happen, but I'm saying I think it will take some time. So ultimately, yes, I do think there'll be a special envoy.
Well, we won't get into names right now, but turning to Belfast, what would be the reaction, Katie Hayward, in Belfast to the appointment of a U.S. envoy? Would it be helpful?
I think it would be broadly welcome, but and obviously the role that the US plays is very important, and we see that in the fact that Mary Lou McDonald and Doug Beattie, the Ulster Unionist Party leader, are both there at the moment. But it would have to be done very carefully, of course, and with the full engagement across the board in terms of the different parties and different political perspectives. Obviously, with engagement with the UK government as well as with the Irish government on this. So symbolically, it would be very significant, and I think it would be broadly welcome. And it's certainly something that has been requested and asked for from civic leaders and certain groups and organisations. But any envoy would be coming into a very changed situation, and one of increased and heightened sensitivities, as has already been mentioned.
Okay. And Brian, what's your view?
Well, we're in a very tense moment, Ted. Our politics is in a very tense moment. It's in a very fraught place. But I've argued many times that this place works best with outside help and with international help. You've mentioned George Mitchell. We had General de Chastelin, who saw through the decommissioning process, Chris Patton on the process of police reform. Now, we're a long way from the euphoria of the ceasefires of 1994 and the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. I remember going to New York in 1995 to do an interview with Bruce Morrison a year after the IRA ceasefire announcement of 1994 as part of a documentary I was doing at that time for the BBC. And there was a great deal of hope at that stage. And probably what we didn't understand then, Ted, was this whole idea of process, and I've heard someone speak at a conference not that many years ago, describing peace as a 50-year process. Well, if it's a 50-year process, we're only halfway to peace. There's certainly no peace of mind in this place at this stage, in many of its places and in many of its corners. And I think what we need most help with from outside of us is probably this question of how we address our past. We left it unresolved. It wasn't part of the Good Friday Agreement. It wasn't part of police reform. And yet the past is so large in our present at this stage. Richard Haas and Megan O'Sullivan tried to help with it. But we've been on a legacy roundabout in terms of conversation, a conversation in circles for the best part of 15 years. And I think we need outside help and we need international help to try to resolve that question of the past, how its questions are answered, how the hurts are addressed. We're in a moment where the UK government is thinking of going on a solo run. I actually have argued for years that we need an amnesty, but I mean an amnesty to open up an information process or a truth process. This UK government proposal has been seen very much as the opposite. It's about an attempt to shut down the past and to leave many of those questions unanswered. And I heard someone speak recently about our past being a mass grave on which we try to build. So we talk about new politics, we talk about new policing, we talk about the new peace, but all the time we're trying to build it on top of that unanswered past. So maybe more than a US envoy, I think what we need is an international team at this stage to deal with that big piece of work, the question of the past, and to try to write a report or an analysis of the conflict years with pens that are free of emotional ink. If we don't resolve the past, then in 20 years' time in a conference like this, other people are going to be asking, why did you not try to sort this out? Never mind today, 2021, in the period of the 1990s, when we had the political agreements and we had the ceasefires and we had those first steps into a peace process.
Well, that's very clear, Brian, and there is still division in Northern Ireland. Reconciliation hasn't really happened. William Butler Yeats was right. Peace comes dropping slow in Ireland as well. Bruce, what's your view? And I'm conscious of the fact that your name has been thrown around as potential US Special Envoy to Northern Ireland. So leaving that aside, do you support the concept of a United States helping to provide a safe place for the parties to come together?
Well, I think it's always been a good idea if it's done well. And it obviously, things are not always done well. So people could hold their judgment on whether it can be executed. George Mitchell was not initially appointed as the envoy. He was appointed as an economic envoy because neither the Irish government nor the British government wanted a political envoy. And George Mitchell, by his work on the issue of decommissioning and as well as on the economic issues, kind of earned his place as the chair of the negotiations. No one ever said he was the political envoy. He just went and did it. And the skill with which he worked with the parties, the patience, I think is the right word, with which he worked through the negotiations, makes everybody think back and say, oh, George Mitchell was a great envoy. But it was really a process. And people came to trust him because of his work over a number of projects. And that's a lesson. I think we need to think about what the next stage of the peace process is. The peace process has run a long time. Brian saying 50 years is what it takes, and maybe it takes that or more. But there's been a lot of wasted time during these 20 plus years. Legacy has been allowed to languish and become a political football. Today, we have an agreement of all the parties that what the British are proposing is no good. But actually, there's two views of why it's no good. The wrong people getting off is why it's no good. It's just a different fingering of who the wrong people are. And that's sort of a kind of agreement that doesn't lead anywhere. So there's going to need to be a breakthrough on a number of issues. And at central is the divisions, the segregation, or whatever you want to call it, of lives of people in Northern Ireland along sectarian grounds, not religious grounds, but really ethnic grounds. Education, housing, these things are as separate as they ever were. And they really are not, you can't build a common future with a segregated present. And somehow that's going to have to be addressed. I don't think these things are going to be easy. I don't think an envoy is a magic bullet of any kind or a magic potion of any kind. but people need to talk to each other about things that they don't want to talk about in public. And the things that America has done best in this peace process is to talk to people in private and talk to people in settings that are safe and get people to just let their guard down a little and think a little bit more generously about how the future could be different from the present and in a positive way. So I think that that's a job for someone or someones. And I think the US government is an honest broker, even if some people want to paint it, in a particular color. The US government has always said, this is a thing for the people of Northern Ireland to work out and for the Irish and British governments to work out together. The US is not in any sense interested in imposing any kind of solutions, but Americans care deeply about Ireland and care deeply about peace in Ireland. And that's worth a lot in the world where most people don't seem to care about anybody else.
Thanks for that. And you make a great point about education and the need for that to bring people together. Another way to bring people together in Northern Ireland is, of course, economic prosperity and new jobs. And last year, Michael Gove, member of the British Cabinet, British Secretary for Levelling Up, said businesses in Northern Ireland under the protocol would get the best of both worlds, quote unquote. And I guess my question for the panel is, has this happened? Do the recent decisions by Almac Pharmaceutical and another company, Ardagh Metal Packaging, to create 1,100 new jobs in Northern Ireland bear this out? Indeed, on Monday, the Financial Times reported that Northern Ireland is the fastest growing region in the UK. So it would seem that under the protocol, having access to both the EU market and to the British market, Northern Ireland is in a unique position, probably for the first time in 100 years, to be in an advantageous position vis-a-vis the Republic and the rest of the United Kingdom. So that surely is important. And I'm wondering, Professor Hayward-Katie, I know constitutional issues often can trump economic issues, but isn't it important that the protocol does appear to be working out well for business?
Well, interestingly enough, today there was reports of a pro-Brexit business person from a unionist background saying the protocol is a very good thing and that Northern Ireland shouldn't lose out on the opportunities that the protocol brings. But the picture is a very mixed one. It's the experiences of Brexit and the protocol differ according to not just sectors, but even subsectors. And exporters are doing very well, for example, in certain industries. But there are genuine difficulties with the protocol, particularly as it affects SMEs trying to import goods from GB. And we know that yet the protocol isn't fully implemented. So there are genuine concerns and very specific and significant difficulties that do need to be addressed. So those UK-EU talks at the moment are very important, and it's very good at this stage that both the UK and the EU are engaging more with businesses here to get evidence to inform the decisions that they have to make, and that we hope they do make, given the short amount of time left before the end of the year. So there is a risk, yes, that that progress on those talks and those real difficulties that do need to be addressed could actually get overlooked in the bigger UK-EU tensions. And I think this is one thing that was quite interesting recently when we had the threat of the use of Article 16 that remains on the table, those safeguard measures. And the contribution from the US at the time was very significant, I think, in the UK pulling back from that. And also, of course, the clarity from the EU that if the UK was to go in that direction, that there would be a very significant response. So that, I think, did help focus minds at the time, because there is, as is so often the case here, just a concern that actually Northern Ireland and the realities of the situation are kind of secondary, and there are other intentions at work here, and the long-term ramifications, both practically speaking but also politically, are not necessarily always thought through in some of the words and deeds from both sides, but particularly from the British government at the moment.
Well, Brian, you know the Loyalist community very well. Dr. John Kyle of the Progressive Unionist Party recently said there were real opportunities arising from a reformed protocol, and I know his own party sort of shot that down pretty quickly. But you know, do you see some openings there on the ground that people actually do welcome the economic benefits?
Well, John Kyle spoke about political unionism and civic unionism and how there is two different positions in all of this. Now, he also made it clear that he had great difficulty with the protocol and it needed fundamental reform. But I think it's very, you've cited some of the opportunities in terms of job creation, in terms of the recent economic figures. But all of that has been drowned out in the political noise of here and now. That's the problem. It's difficult to have those conversations about benefits and opportunities when in this place some people believe and have been led to believe that the union is under threat. And I was interested in what Bruce was saying a moment or two ago about the next stage or the next phase of the peace process. So it's not just about what's happening around Brexit. If you go back to the 2017 Assembly election, unionism lost its overall majority in the Stormont Assembly. Go to the European election of 2019, unionism lost its second seat in the European Parliament. Then go to the UK general election of December 2019, and unionists no longer hold the majority of Northern Ireland seats at Westminster. So there's a bend on the road. There is a different direction in our politics. And when Bruce was first involved in this process, probably 1980s into early 1990, we had John Hume speaking at that stage about the need for an agreed Ireland. Well, if you don't have an agreement, it's not agreed. But in the moment that we're in, that new Ireland conversation is getting and is becoming much louder, and as I said earlier, some would say more creditable. Now, I think the new Ireland conversation, which is maybe the next phase or the next stage of our peace process that Bruce is talking about, needs to be a blank sheet conversation. Needs to start on a blank page. Is it an economically creditable, viable project? How does education and health work island-wide? What is the transition period? What is European involvement in it? What is the UK government involvement in it? What is the US involvement in that process? Will there be a distinct northern political institution? What is culture and identity in the new Ireland? And I think unless you can answer those questions, we shouldn't ask the question. And I think that should be the learning from the Brexit project. Brexit, we had so much spin around Brexit about what it would mean. None of the downside of Brexit was discussed. And all of a sudden, this protocol has arrived. The Irish Sea border is there. I say unionism and loyalism constitutionally unnerved. But we're talking about Brexit. We're talking about the fallout from Brexit. But there is a much wider frame to it. And that is that we're in changing times. I mentioned the political, the change in terms of political numbers. And I think the most important thing to remember when we discuss the new Ireland, neither green nor orange, but what we talk about when we talk about Northern Ireland, can win a border poll. There is a third pillar in our politics now, which we call other, representing about 20% of the vote in Northern Ireland. And it will be a major deciding factor in any border poll when it comes. But I think to discuss just the fallout from Brexit without that wider context of that nervousness within unionism, how our politics is changing, is to miss something of a point, Ted.
Thank you. Congressman Boyle, How do you respond to that? The challenge of a new Ireland and how the United States could play a role in that?
I was very interested in those comments, and frankly, I think it's just an exciting opportunity. I know that human nature being what it is, that change can sometimes be unsettling to people, but really it's an enormous opportunity. And then specifically, not all island-wide, but specifically in the north, I observe that, and these are rough numbers, but I would say that in terms of a border poll, and I wrote this maybe a year ago in the Irish Times, roughly 40% or so of people would view themselves as unionists or of the Orange tradition and would vote in a border poll strictly on that basis. And roughly 40% would do the same from a nationalist or a green background. But it's that middle 20%. They tend to be increasingly Alliance Party voters, maybe middle-class Catholic SDLP voters, maybe just not voters at all and kind of checked out of the political process, perhaps younger. It's that middle 20% that I think will decide things. And I would tend to believe that if we're having this conversation, as I'm sure we will 5 years from now, that middle 20% would even grow in time to even be bigger than it is. I think that, if we're going back 25 years ago, we would have been shocked that the number of people who identify as something other than those strict sectarian terms would be higher than single digits. I think people would have been pretty surprised by that. And yes, I do believe that there is a role for the United States in this, not, of course, to impose anything, but to help. There are a lot of us, myself included, who are quite proud of our Irish roots. For me and my family, they're much more recent than perhaps for some other Americans. But that depth of feeling is sincere, and I think can be very helpful. Ultimately, though, it will be the people of Ireland, island-wide, who will ultimately make these decisions. But helping facilitate that process over the course of this exciting decade, I see that as a proper role for the United States, the international community at large, and also for the diaspora.
Yeah, indeed, Ireland is changing. You think that the Republic of Ireland had a referendum on marriage equality and passed it. I think it was probably, Dan, the first country to have a referendum on that issue. Most others did it through legislation.
And Ted, might I add, when the Republic of Ireland did that, it was by such a margin. Frankly, had there been a referendum at that same time in the United States, I don't think, while I think you would have seen the same result here for marriage equality, you would have not seen the same high percentage that it received in Ireland.
Yeah, so as Brian says, it's neither green nor orange. Whatever color, I'm not sure artist, whatever color comes in between that. But traditionally, of course, it was the white one of peace. Do we have questions from the floor? I'm conscious of our time here, and I'd like to recognize some. Yes, sir. I need a mic here in the second row.
Thank you. My question is for you, Congressman Boyle. I actually work for your colleague, Dr. Murphy, on the other side of the aisle. And it's broadly to build off the points made by Brian and Bruce. We see with loyalist withdrawal from the Good Friday Agreement while remaining committed to peace, and the DUP never supporting it in general, and everything we've seen with the political shift with unionism becoming less and less represented. There's clearly a threat of violence, and matching that with Sinn Féin's electoral success on both sides of the island, is now the time for the United States to become more involved, not just to have a special envoy, but perhaps to, as we've said with this new Ireland, look at the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement, and maybe start looking at a new robust agreement, something more robust than New Decade, New Approach, more robust than St. Andrews. Is this the time, is this the next step in the process to not just have an envoy, not just to say President Biden is Irish, but to actually engage with both sides of the island, unionists and nationalists, to ensure peace, long-term peace, rather than a certain political outcome?
Thanks for that question. Congressman Boyle.
Yeah, well, thanks. A great question. And I can't see the question on my side, but he mentioned that he worked for a colleague of mine on the other side of the aisle. That underscores an important aspect here, is that when it comes to support for Ireland, support for the Irish peace process, it is historically and still is a bipartisan endeavor here on Capitol Hill. And I think that's always important to remind people of that. Now, in terms of the substance of the question, look, I'm proud of the role that the United States played in helping to foster the peace process, the pretty brave decision that President Clinton made, listening to those on Capitol Hill like Bruce who were advocating for him to get involved in the early 90s. He put up with a lot of grief from his own State Department, as well as the British government, at least initially. Then once Tony Blair came into office, it was more welcoming, at least, of the American role. And since that time, we have, because it has been, as was mentioned, the Good Friday Agreement might be, a date in history, but it actually was much more the beginning than any sort of end. It was, in fact, the beginning of this very long peace process. And so successive presidents, George W. Bush, he didn't have to, but kept American involvement even after Bill Clinton left. And then obviously that carried through all the way to the present day, as well as here on Capitol Hill. I wouldn't, in terms of, you mentioned the St. Andrews Agreement and New Decade, New Approach. Obviously, there have been successive agreements. Not all of the aspects of those agreements have ever fully been implemented, I would point out. Those possibilities of some future agreement exist, but not that it would ever take the place of the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement. If you were to look around the world at the last 30 years, you would find a lot of failed peace processes. And so, the Good Friday Agreement, even with its frustrations and its faults, and even as progress has sometimes been 2 steps forward, 1 step back, let's not minimize the enormous achievement that it was at its signing, as well as it has been throughout this, because you only need look around the world to see that this is actually the exception to the rule and not the rule itself.
Great, thank you. Any other questions from the floor?
Ted, could I say something on that question if you've got a moment? There was a reference to the possibility of violence in that question, Ted, and what I would say is the wars here are over. So yes, we've had some localized and sporadic violence recently, but nothing on the scale of the conflict years. That's not to dismiss what has happened recently, but it is to try to keep it in some context. I think another important point to make is that when I think about the ceasefires and I think about the Good Friday Agreement, they were for the generations that come next. They weren't really for the conflict generation. Yet part of the conflict generation holds on to the ceasefires and holds on to the Good Friday Agreement and holds on to the past as if they own it, as if it's theirs. They need to let go. And, one of the big pieces of learning, I think, out of the New Decade, New Approach agreement was the importance of the 2 governments being involved. So New Decade, New Approach was an initiative brought forward by Julian Smith and then Taoiseach Simon Coveney, still Irish foreign minister. They put a document on the table and they dared the 5 parties here to reject it. But I think one of the big pieces of learning for me out of New Decade, New Approach was that Julian Smith, as Secretary of State, brought 2 special advisors with him. Lila Howson-Smith, who was 26, and Ross Easton, who was 31. And they came here with an attitude of what can be done rather than what can't be done. And they came with an attitude of how politics works elsewhere. I think the conflict generation needs to let go. If this place is to work and to get to that next phase of the the peace process that Bruce mentioned earlier, to a possible next agreement beyond the Good Friday Agreement, then the conflict generation needs to let go. And we need to find a way of not forgetting about the past or putting a line in the sand. I mean, there's no line thick enough to draw through our past or under our past or over our past. We need to find a process that addresses those questions.
Very good
but then
point.
I think we need to hand the politics of the future to the next generation.
You make a very good point, Brian. And I take it very personally as a conflict generation member myself.
I am as well.
There's a question here, final question we'll just squeeze in. Yes, Kevin.
One of the key objectives of the Good Friday Agreement was a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland, which has languished and lingered. There was a new effort under the New Decade, New Approach to kind of put some energy back into the Bill of Rights for Ireland, and that's now kind of come to a stop by opposition from the DUP. Is there a role for the United States to play in supporting a push for a Bill of Rights in Northern Ireland, given our own rich history?
Who wants to take that one? Bill of Rights. Bruce?
Yeah, I'll take that on. Kevin, thanks for the hot potato there. The fact is that the Bill of Rights is an action that's important for all the symbolism that goes with it, about recognizing individual rights over against the state, really. Many rights are already recognized in Northern Ireland. So the reason the Bill of Rights doesn't move forward isn't because of the details of the Bill of Rights. It's because of the contention around whose agenda is this and what is it trying to accomplish. As I think of where we are, I think more of 1912 than any other date in our history, because of the things that were signaled in 1912 about the irreconcilable differences on the island of Ireland, or so-called, and the failure to deal with them in a timely fashion. So partition was a quick and dirty way to deal with something much deeper. Hasn't been dealt with. It still plagues us. All the people in Northern Ireland deserve the rights that would come from a Bill of Rights, but we won't get there by ignoring why it is that people would object. Why would people object? It's not the British thing to do. Is that a reason to object? It's an agenda on something in the Bill of Rights that people don't like. We got to get to the fundamentals for there to be another generation of progress. And I think that Brian's so right to say, and Brendan's so right to say, we don't have a breakdown of the Good Friday Agreement. We have lack of progress that we should have, but we haven't got a breakdown. We have a real commitment to peace rather than war. And it was a war. It wasn't just a skirmish. It was a war fought by many, and with very far-reaching consequences for many individuals and families. We've got beyond that. We haven't got beyond it in terms of understanding who did what to whom, but we are beyond that. We are in a peace process and a commitment to peace. We need to build on that. And so a Bill of Rights can build on that, but only, like everything else in this, it's got to be an agreed process. And we need agreement more than we're getting today. I mean, division, Brexit was the worst thing to happen to Northern Ireland, regardless of its merits for the rest of Great Britain. It was the worst thing because it's division. And division is already rampant in Northern Ireland, and we need to bridge division, not divide further. And unfortunately, Brexit has done all of that.
Well, I think we're running, thanks for that, Bruce. I think we're running out of time. I want to thank our four panelists for a very rich discussion. I think there's room for optimism, some interesting directions going forward, and we really learned a lot from all of you. And if you would give them a round of applause, I think that would be very appropriate. So with that, thanks for your attention. I'll hand you back to Professor Kennedy for his concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ted. Thanks, Ted. My concluding remarks are really to give out some thank yous, which are very important. The first one is to you, Ted, and to your panelists, bringing us to the end of our third symposium. I'm minded that these symposiums would not take place if you and Dan Mulhall had not got together a few years ago and had an idea for something called Bridging the Atlantic. So we all offer you a profound thanks, and there's evidence today of how valuable that is. Judging by our discussions today, the Ireland-US relationship remains vibrant, evolving, at the same time, as we've heard, is of a piece with transitions in transatlantic relations, in which there do remain tensions and challenges. At the outset, I mentioned President Clinton's exhortation last year to keep advancing the conversations. Bridging the Atlantic is only possible through collaboration. And in closing, I want to thank our hosting partners at Georgetown University, the Global Irish Studies Initiative, and the BMW Centre for German and European Studies within the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service, who have so enthusiastically and diligently made this event possible. In particular, thanks to Colleen Parsons, who's standing quietly at the back of the room there, very modestly, but waving. Thank you. I'm sure known to all of you as the director of the Global Irish Studies Initiative for his energy and imagination in bringing this event together. Thanks to Mary Turcott for her assistance throughout, and to our own Catherine Carey at UCD as well in that regard. I also want to thank Christina Ruby, who's here, I hope, and I will see again before we leave. Yes, hi, Tina. The Assistant Director of the BMW Centre for German and European Studies, for her good works in making this event happen without friction. Thanks at a distance, but with admiration and gratitude, to Dr. Joanne Murphy at Queen's University, such a key partner in this collaboration. Thanks to Optimum AV Services and Georgetown Catering for their support today. And I will just add that there is catering remains at the back of this hall, and when we finish in a few seconds, please help yourselves if you would like to do that. A big call out to the Georgetown students, faculty and alumni who took the trouble to come to us physically today. It is so good to see real human beings. Thank you for being here. And finally, let me express thanks to the Irish Embassy here in Washington for its fulsome support of this event, and in particular, Cathal, Emily, Harry and Norma. And also again to Ambassador Mulhall, not just for speaking today, but helping to reach out to many of our speakers. Thank you, Ambassador. If you missed any of part of today's discussions, you can catch the recording of the event. It will initially be posted on the Global Irish website at Georgetown University. Thank you all for being with us today.